Great. How many are tired? Okay, sweet. How many want to go to bed? Okay. How many are excited? Yeah. Okay. There we go. Excellent. Are we good to go?
I think we are.
We're good to go back there. Okay. Great. Well, guys, this is the last morning. We got these two guys with us for just two more lectures, essentially. Dr. Richards is going to have to take off pretty short. Well, basically immediately after his lecture. So. Walk with us if you want to ask him some questions. Otherwise, just hold your peace there. But let's please welcome Dr. Richards this morning.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm sensing from the fact that there's no breakfast available and the building is locked that you normally don't meet at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. So this is either, here we go. So is there breakfast going? They do. Okay, so that, I don't count that as breakfast. Yeah, but those things didn't even exist until 100 years ago, so how can that be the definition of breakfast? But, so it's either bonus or extra, depending on your perspective, I suppose. But what I want to do this morning is I want to sort of present an argument for you because what I've discovered, and I live in the D.C. area, which is a non-representative sample of humanity, but nevertheless, it's in some ways perhaps a leading indicator of where the culture is going, and there's a lot of people that if you talk to them about politics and economics and their ideas, will refer to themselves as libertarian, and they will also be atheists. And this thing gets bundled together. Now, this isn't what the word libertarian means in every time and place. I actually don't know what the average libertarian thinks in Minnesota. In Seattle, if somebody said they were libertarian, they were probably really jazzed about legalized pot. That was like their issue. That's kind of what it referred to in Seattle. And so the word is slippery. It's like the word liberal or anything. You know, it's the boundaries are quite fuzzy and ambiguous. But there is a large and growing libertarian movement that's not just interested in sort of economic freedom and limited government and things like that. In fact, I've spoken at Tea Party rallies in Texas and places like that, and people that call themselves libertarian there are just as likely to go to the local Southern Baptist church. And so there's a lot of slippage on this thing. So I don't want to imply that there's this tight definition of libertarian. What I want you to get in your minds is this growing movement and this way of thinking among many people, and especially among Americans, but not just Americans, both that things like economic freedom, limited government, freedom and responsibility itself, what I'll call moral realism, the belief that there's certain things that are intrinsically right and intrinsically wrong, that these are all really good things, that they are true about reality, and at the same time that there is no God, all right? And so this is the kind of bundle of ideas that I want to deal with this morning. And I'm not going to try to present an argument for the existence of God, nor am I certainly not going to try to show that people are foolish to believe in freedom and responsibility and limited government, moral realism. What I want to show you is that these ideas are incompatible, that they just do not go well together. And this is not a sort of deductive argument, if there's freedom, therefore materialism is false, or something as simple as that. What I just want you to see, I want you to think about this in terms of a cluster of values that I'm going to call, let's just call them libertarian values, okay, a small l. And so you could call this, can we have freedom without God, or why libertarians need God? And depending on the audience, I maybe change the title. So, and I have actually given a talk like this to people that are more or less atheist libertarians. And there were no sort of massive conversions to Christianity, but there was a lot of cognitive dissonance and disturbance. So I feel like, well, that's accomplishing something. So what do I mean by core libertarian values? Well, these are the sorts of things that if you were to have a room full of people that are of this mindset, of this perspective, and you ask them, what are the kind of core ideas that really animate you, especially when it comes to politics and economics? They might not use these words, but this is more or less what you would end up with. The first is the idea of individual rights. The great statement of Thomas Jefferson from the Declaration of Independence that people have particular rights and that the state and other people are duty-bound to respect. Freedom and individual responsibility. These things go together, that people are responsible for their actions, that they have the capacity to act freely, and that their freedom ought to be respected, and that a just and limited government should respect their freedom. Reason. Ludwig von Mises has a great line where he says the case for the free market presents itself to the cool and dispassionate mind and for people who can follow premises through to their conclusions. I'm paraphrasing, but this is his idea. In other words, crazy bad economic ideas appeal to people's emotions and their untutored intuitions. The case for the free market and economic freedom presents itself to our reason. And so if you're dispassionate and rational, you will follow this. And this is why, you can get in these knockdown, drag-out arguments about the minimum wage or a flat tax or whatever, because there's this conviction that reason is actually something and that it can lead you, at least in some cases, to the truth. That's a fundamental belief about the nature of the human mind and discourse and things like that. And in some ways, it's sort of old-fashioned these days. This is a fairly unpopular idea. Moral realism, what do I mean there? What I mean by moral realism is that there are certain moral claims that are true about reality. They're just, they provide some description of what reality is like. So if you say, it's wrong to torture small children for the fun of it, right? And if you think that's objectively wrong in some way, just as it would be wrong, to say that 2 + 2 = 5, that makes you a moral realist. Right? If you think, well, maybe that's true for our community in some sense, and clearly you're playing with the word true at that point, but not sort of true in some broad sense for everyone regardless of their time and place, then you're not necessarily a moral realist. Libertarians are overwhelmingly moral realists, and so they get absolutely infuriated by the idea that the government, for instance, should force people to hold a particular religious view. Right? So they have a moral indignation that they think is sort of true about reality. Then finally, limited government. That government maybe has a legitimate role. They might not say it has a God-given role, but it has some kind of legitimate but very limited role. And when it goes beyond its proper limits, it's actually doing something that's wrong. And so the arguments for limited government that you get from people that think of themselves as libertarians is almost always a moral argument and not a merely prudential argument. So if you told them, well, if we had an absolute state, children could be educated more efficiently and we could deliver goods and services, even if you could sort of establish that, they would think, no, there's just something wrong with the coercive power of the state being used in that way. So they very quickly cease to be utilitarians when it comes to these core convictions. And so what I don't want to do is sort of establish, I'm not going to try to establish that if you believe this, that theism is true, or if you believe this, there must be a God. But rather, I want you to think of this in terms of what you might call comparing competing hypotheses, multiple competing hypotheses. And in this case, there's 2 hypotheses. What we want to say is, if these are true, if those values, as I'm calling them, are descriptively true in some sense, in which metaphysical framework do they make the most sense? In a materialist framework or in a theistic framework. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're not trying to either infer to the existence of God or deducing things, taking the existence of God as a first principle and seeing what follows. What we're saying is, given those ideas of freedom and responsibility and moral realism and all those, and reason and everything else, in which context do they make the most sense? Where do they find the better metaphysical home? In theism or materialism? Right? Now, this is already a question that people don't like to ask. What we tend to do, if you sort of do a little introspection and think about your strongest moral convictions, what you will inevitably discover is that you at least feel like you know them immediately and directly. So if you reflect on my claim that it's wrong to torture small children for the fun of it, you don't spend a bunch of time thinking, well, what else do I believe and know? And could I infer that from, is there something I learned in history or maybe in my chemistry class that would lead to the conclusion that that's wrong? You don't do that, do you? You know it, or at least you think you know it immediately and directly. In fact, you have a kind of sense of your knowledge of that that's more direct than any knowledge you could have about science or history, almost anything else. It's a sort of direct sense that you have. That doesn't mean that we don't come to our moral beliefs by way of reason and reflection in some sense. It's just that once they're established, if we know them directly, and they tend to be prior to everything else. And so that's kind of, I want you to sort of see that when you're sort of, that's just an act of introspection. That's the way we kind of come to know these things, and that's the way actually everyone reacts. And if there's a very interesting book, don't recommend it entirely, but there's some interesting insights by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt at the University of Virginia called The Righteous Mind, in which they developed this sort of matrix to analyze people's moral beliefs, and especially people moral beliefs across the political spectrum, and what he discovered was that this is how people tend to hold their moral beliefs. And so if you've got a fundamental moral belief and then some other thing that contradicts it, that moral belief trumps the other thing, precisely because it's prior, it's sort of fundamental. The only question is whether we have a faculty that allows us to hold these things so that we actually know them, or are we just deceiving ourselves when we hold these moral beliefs? But we don't hold them sort of dispassionately, as if there's some question about, okay, now when was it that Columbus sailed the ocean blue? I remember it was kind of a long time ago. Was it before the Civil War? I mean, this is, you think I'm joking, but you've seen some of these polls from high school kids that they don't quite know when these things happen. And so you might go, I'll go Google that. See, when did Columbus sail the ocean blue? Right? You hold that belief tentatively if you don't have a good historical education. You don't hold your fundamental moral beliefs in that way. All right, so let's go through these. And what I want to do is I want to show you each of these ideas as sort of examples of what I'm calling libertarian beliefs. And then rather than making an argument in detail abstractly on my own, I want to show you what authoritative materialists and atheists say about these things. Okay, so we could construct the argument here ourselves for these things, but I think it's important, if you want to know, okay, what is the kind of clear implication of a particular idea, find its best representatives and see what they say the implications of their ideas are. If you want to know what an implication of Darwinism is, find a really smart Darwinist, and he or she will tell you what the implications are, and usually that's a reliable indication. And this is the kind of thing that's disturbing to people that think of themselves as libertarian, to discover that actually the people that share your metaphysical beliefs deny the existence of that very thing. The idea of individual rights, of course, it's a common inheritance, certainly of Americans, but really these days of most people, at least since the late 1940s with the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But Americans, when we think of individual rights, invariably think of their articulation in the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson with help from some other American founders like Ben Franklin. Now, Jefferson wasn't an Orthodox Christian, and yet when he went to appeal to the idea of individual rights, what did he do? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He explicitly invoked the existence of a Creator, and he grounded the very idea of individual rights, that we have certain rights inherent in us. These aren't conferred on us by our parents, they're not conferred on us by the state. We have them by nature of what we are, and a just and limited government is duty-bound to respect and to recognize those rights in its laws and its institutions. And then, now, why did he do that? Was it just a kind of rhetorical flourish because there's a lot of people that believe in God, let's do that? No, I don't think so. I think it's actually very difficult to mount the case for individual rights without something like this. Now, am I saying that an atheist doesn't know we're equal? No, not at all. There's still a moral law written on the heart. But when you start reflecting on the idea of, okay, how do we ground this idea that we all have some kind of equality, that we all have inherent rights? You're not going to get that empirically, right? By empirical, I mean you're not going to get it by observing. Would you figure out that people are inherently equal in rights and dignity just by observation? Would you do a Mensa test? Or how would you come to this conclusion? In fact, by observation, we're quite unequal. Some people are smarter than others, some are more attractive than others, some are more virtuous than others, some work hard, some are as lazy as they can possibly be. Right? You'd never come to the conclusion that we're equal. In fact, that's why most cultures in most times and places explicitly denied this idea. The ancient Greeks and Romans explicitly denied this idea, with perhaps the exception of the Stoics, precisely because it doesn't seem to derive from anything. And so it makes sense that Jefferson would ground our rights in a theological claim. I mentioned the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So this was after World War II, and there was an attempt at the development, the establishment of the UN to make a universal claim for human rights for everyone. And if you follow the debate, you can look this up, there was actually a struggle because they explicitly did not want to make a theological claim. And it turns out they couldn't figure out how to do it. And so they ended up borrowing this work of a French 20th century philosopher named Jacques Maritain, which was implicitly still theistic, but maybe it didn't have to directly invoke the Creator. In other words, they had a really hard time coming up with the case for individual rights without some kind of theological grounding. This is so powerful, this idea, though, that even people who deny explicitly the sort of theological foundation of it nevertheless invoke the idea. My favorite examples of this is from Ayn Rand, whom you all met the other night. She's a deeply committed atheist, very, very anti-Christian. And yet Rand said this. She said, every man, that is every human being, is an end in himself and not a mere means to the ends of others. Now, where does she get this idea? Where does she get the idea that human beings are ends in themselves? Right? That they have their own sort of internal logic and purposes and end that ought to be respected and should not be reduced to the means as a slave or something that can be manipulated as an object for others. I don't actually have any idea where she got this idea. I suspect that she's living off the fumes of the kind of Judeo-Christian idea of rights, and it seemed intuitively true to her, and she was right to perceive it was true, but she didn't in her own philosophy actually have a way of justifying it. It was just one of these first principles that seemed true. And so that's what's interesting, and you will discover this with almost everyone who calls him or herself a libertarian. So the question is, how does this idea fare among thoughtful materialists and atheists? Not very well. There's a great quote from the founder of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, in a telling book titled Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Here's what he says. He says, autonomous man has been constructed from our ignorance, and as our understanding increases, the very stuff from which he is composed vanishes. To man, qua man, we readily say good riddance. Only by dispossessing him can we turn to the real causes of human behavior. Only then can we turn from the inferred to the observed, from the miraculous to the natural, from the inaccessible to the manipulable. Notice that what he's doing, he's saying we can't observe persons, right, agents. What we can observe is things that bodies do externally in terms of their behavior. In fact, they might tell us that they're doing things for various reasons, but it's entirely unscientific because we can't observe that. It's inaccessible. In fact, he calls it miraculous, and he doesn't mean that nicely. Right? It's a pejorative, that when you invoke a person and an agent that's doing things, that might as well be invoking God raising somebody from the dead. It doesn't make any sense in terms of his understanding of science. No individuals. If you haven't heard that before, that's a profound implication that, in fact, there are not individuals in the sense that we imagine. There's individuals, conscious agents that have something internal to themselves that allow them to act for a particular reason. And this makes perfect sense if you think about it. If human beings are ultimately matter in motion, right? Atoms colliding with atoms, congealing over time according to deterministic laws to become molecules. Some of these eventually get to put together over long periods of time in this form. We're ultimately reducible to blind forces, then we're reducible to blind forces. There can't be these agents floating around sort of acting on the material world. It makes no sense. This is what Bertrand Russell said about that idea of responsibility, also an atheist. This is from his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, which is actually not a very impressive book. But he was one of the leading philosophers in the analytic tradition in the 20th century. Here's what he said. He said, when a man acts in ways that annoy us, we wish to think him wicked. In other words, he did something that irritated us. That's because he's a bad person. And we refuse to face the fact that his annoying behavior is the result of antecedent causes, which, if you follow them long enough, will take you beyond the moment of his birth, and therefore to events which he cannot be held responsible by any stretch of the imagination. So people do things, you think, okay, why did he do that? He needs to be punished for that. But that's actually not thinking clearly, Bertrand Russell says. He says what you need to understand that everything that person does is a result of causes that came before him, that he had no control over prior to his birth, in deep history. All of these things ultimately gave rise to his existence and all his dispositions and everything he does. Right? And he has no power over any of those things. So it's actually an illusion to think that there are persons that have responsibilities. And notice freedom and responsibility go together here. Right? You get, in order for someone to be responsible, they have to be able to exercise freedom. Oh, I turned it off. That's actually not the end of the slideshow. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, we're just getting started. Okay, so here's the idea, right? If you're a materialist, you basically got two categories with which you can explain persons. I'm going to ask all of y'all questions over there, by the way, at the end. So if you're, I'll call on you first. What is a person? A person is ultimately the sum total of their nature, that is their biology and the physics and chemistry that builds them, and then nurture. And nurture just has to do with sort of the environmental context in which you're raised. Turns out even nurture in this framework finally reduces to nature too, because it's not like the environment's something outside the natural world. And that's all the individual is all the kind of sum total of all these causes. All right? Well, what needs to be true for what philosophers call libertarian freedom to exist? Libertarian freedom is not just getting to do what you want to do. Right? It could be that you're getting to do what you want to do, like maybe some of you have seen The Matrix, but you're actually in a vat, right? And so everything you see is an illusion. You think you're free to do what you want to do, but you're actually kind of being governed in another way. Or think of a simpler example. Imagine there's a mad scientist, and he's able to create a cortical implant, and he puts it in your brain. And with that, he's got a PlayStation console, and he can control not only what you do, right, so that he makes your body move, but he can control what you think you want to do. And so you wake up and you find yourself, gosh, I'm going to go to the Army Reserve office over here, and I'm going to ask if I can clean Army latrines for the rest of my life. I just feel the need to do that. All right? Now, you'd be doing what you want to do. Would you be free? No, obviously not. You'd be determined by this crazy mad scientist. So don't get the idea that if you're doing what you want to do, that's all you need for freedom. To have freedom in the libertarian sense, this is different. Don't think of libertarian political idea. This is a philosophical term, is to have the capacity to choose between alternatives, at least sometimes. It doesn't mean everything you do has to have this choice. In fact, most of what we do every day is more or less on autopilot, right? You don't, every time you take a breath, think, gosh, shall I breathe now or not breathe now? Hey, should my heart pump now or maybe? No, imagine if all those things were, you directly had to consciously choose them. You wouldn't get very far. So there's a lot of stuff that's on autopilot for our benefit. But libertarian freedom says we have the capacity, at least for some things, to choose between alternatives. And so what does that mean? That means that something like this must be the case, that certainly nature and nurture shape us. We're biological beings. We're born into families and in communities. We have no control over that. We have all sorts of influences upon us. We have biological dispositions that sort of shape who we are. But those are things that shape us. Those are not things that ultimately determine everything we do and everything we choose. In order for there to be this thing called libertarian freedom, there also has to be an agent capable of making choices, and those choices have to be live alternatives. Well, that agent is what B.F. Skinner would call miraculous. The reason is because it just makes no sense in a materialistic framework. And I'm not saying this. Virtually all the leading materialists not only concede this, but argue this. There can't be freedom and responsibility. In fact, not only can there not be individual rights, there can't really be individuals. The whole idea is nonsense. Right? Now, it's a radical implication of the materialist worldview, but it is that implication. Right, what about reason? So we've dealt with individuals and individual rights and freedom and responsibility. What about reason? We all, of course, assume that we have a capacity for reason, right? That we have this faculty in which we can listen to arguments, we can listen to evidence, and we can come to conclusions that are at least sometimes reliable and that will at least sometimes lead us to truth. And so if that's true, we'd need to have a way of accounting for how we could possibly have this faculty. And yet materialists, especially starting with Darwin, who wasn't a strict materialist, but he was working out the implications of his own theory, realize that they don't actually have a way to mount this idea that we have a capacity for reason. That's what Darwin said actually in his Origin of the Species, written in 1859. For those of you, I don't know if you've covered all this, but Darwin proposed his theory of evolution was not only that organisms share one or a few common ancestors, so that if you work your way back historically, organisms, eventually you get back to a point in which everybody has this, either a single or a few original organisms. That's called the common ancestor. And that wasn't the main, that's part of his theory, but the sort of kicker is that he proposed a mechanism that's purely impersonal and blind. And he argued that this mechanism could mimic the actions of a designer. So it would produce things that look designed, but without any real design. And that was his idea of natural selection and random variation. So you get populations, like a population of water buffalo. They're not all exactly alike. Some are faster than others. Some have pointier horns than others. And if their speed and pointy horns gives certain water buffaloes a selective advantage, so they have an easier time defending themselves from lions, they can run faster and get away from the lions, they're going to tend to survive. And the slow, blunt, horned ones are going to tend to get eaten by lions. And so the faster, pointier horned ones will predominate in the population and reproduce, and then those traits will continue, right, in the population. That's the idea of natural selection. And by itself, you'd say, okay, well, I can see how that would do some things. But Darwin said there are various processes that lead to random variations that aren't designed, that God isn't intentionally doing these things. They just happen for whatever reason. He had all sorts of ideas about how this happened. And you get enough variation, you can eventually use this process over long enough periods of time to explain everything about the way things are adapted in the biological world. All right, now this is now more or less the kind of intellectually orthodox idea, except random variations is identified now with genetic mutations, random genetic mutations. The charm of this idea is that it could he thought at least, produce things that look designed without real design. And I want you to see this is not an argument that everything happens by chance. It's not an argument that everything just happened. It's that mechanistic process by which these things can build up. But he quickly realized, good grief, if this is true, this is sort of worrisome for a reason. It's often called Darwin's doubt. And here's how he put it in The Origin of Species. He said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the minds of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? You get the idea that even as he's developing his theory, he's realizing, gosh, it's sort of subversive. It seems to undercut the very process that I'm using to arrive at the theory. Because the implication of the theory is that our minds that we're using are actually adapted from something that came before that almost certainly doesn't have reason. And if you think monkeys have reason, just go back farther, okay? Because the monkey's mind came from someplace else. I don't want to get in an argument about monkeys and reason and things like that. That's not really the point, all right? Just trying to close off irrelevant questions. That's often called Darwin's doubt. Now, you might think, well, but wait, the Darwinian process, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. If it selects for survival advantage, wouldn't true beliefs, if you have a faculty of the ability to construct true beliefs, wouldn't that have a survival advantage? So wouldn't natural selection select that? That's what people think often when they first hear this idea. But it's not nearly as simple as that. And so call this Darwin's doubt, all right? The problem is that what natural selection could act on is behavior, right? Remember the water buffaloes, if they run faster, if they know the buffaloes that run away from lions, the water buffaloes that do certain things that give them a survival advantage, natural selection could select for that. But would natural selection know which beliefs of the water buffaloes are true or false? No, it wouldn't even matter. It doesn't matter what the beliefs inside, let's assume water buffaloes have beliefs for a minute. It doesn't actually matter what they believe. What natural selection can see and select is their actions or their external traits. It's blind to beliefs. And so natural selection isn't capable of selecting survival-enhancing behaviors that also connect to true beliefs. It's just going to be the behaviors it selects. And again, this is from Patricia Churchland. This is a slightly salty quote, but this is a perfect distillation of the point. She's a philosopher of mind, a neuroscientist. So boiled down to essentials, the nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 Fs: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. This is her actual quote. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Improvements in sensorimotory control confer an evolutionary advantage. A fancier style of representing, that is the mind, is advantageous so long as it is geared to the organism's way of life and enhance the organism's chances of survival. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So this is a process that Churchland says is capable of providing for kind of survival-enhancing sensory motor control and behaviors and traits. It's not capable of selecting true from false beliefs.